Right. Well, as you know, a collective organization here, have picked various topics to talk on, and I kind of do the current events and prophecy and things like that, and so my sermon, or teaching, I guess I really should say, it's more of a teaching, it's not really a sermon, only has one scripture in it. So I want you to, as I kind of studied this topic that I'm about to present, I kept being reminded of this scripture over and over again, and you're all thinking, well, what's the scripture? Well, let me get my PowerPoint thing going here, and I'll let you know. There it is. 2 Corinthians 11:14 in the NIV version. You can read it there. It says, "As no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light." Okay. So what's the topic? Well, I can tell you that as a prelude to this teaching, do not consider me an expert in this topic by any stretch of the imagination. I have just barely scratched the surface of this topic, but I think it's an important topic that we should all be aware of. And you're gonna, when I present the topic, you're gonna kind of know why. But the topic for today is Islam 101. So it really probably should be Islam pre-K, but we're all adults, and when you start as a freshman in college, it's always a 101 course. So here we go. Help me, Jesus. Okay, audience participation time, so don't think you're getting off the hook here. When I say Muslim or Islam, what's the first words or thoughts that come to your mind? Anybody? Okay, evil, murder, terrorists, Ishmael. Good. Man, get some good answers here. Fear. Anything else? Muhammad, good. False religion, very good, yes. All those things, that's pretty much, if I asked people across the United States, mainstream America, that's probably the same answers I would get based on what your answers were. And that's what I would think too. So we're going to kind of delve into this. So these are the questions that I'm hoping to answer today regarding Islam. We're Christians, so why should we care about Islam? Well, hopefully at the end of this lecture, you'll be able to answer that. and get some enlightenment. I'm not going to answer that one right now. Who was Muhammad? Obviously, Jacob knew something about Muhammad in relation to Islam. Very good. And how did Islam originate? What's the Quran and the Hadith? Who and where are Muslims, and how many are there out there in the world? Do all Muslims share the same beliefs? What is Sharia law? What is jihad, and why should I care? So if you watch the news at all, you're going to hear terms on there like ISIS, ISIL, jihad, Sharia law. You're going to hear all these terms. If you live in a cave, you might not have heard any of this. But if you watch the news, every day there's news events concerning ISIS and ISIL and things like that. So I think it's an important topic to kind of know. The Bible says we shouldn't be ignorant of things. I think it's important to know. So you're either going to be bored out of your skull during this lecture, or you're going to get into it. So it's just kind of the way we're doing our teaching. There's going to be topics that are very interesting to various people, but we're trying to break it out into what you wanted to hear. So some of you wanted to hear this, some didn't. So, but bear with me. And of course, the big question is, will Jonathan be able to complete this today? I don't know. I can't answer that question. There's a lot of material here, so we'll see. Okay, the life of Muhammad. So Muhammad was a man that was born, as it says there, in Mecca around 570 AD, and that city is known to be in Saudi Arabia. It's also where all the Muslims congregate during the festival of, it's not Ramadi, it's Ramadan. Thank you very much. Ramadan. So about 2.3 million Muslims congregate there a year. It's part of their religion that they're required to go there at least once in their lifetime. And if you shoot back to this slide, that's Mecca, and that's the time of Ramadan where millions of people are gathered in there. So those are all those little dots are people. Yes, ma'am. No. Thanks for asking that, though, because I was supposed to. Thank you very much. Really, I'm supposed to tell you that at the beginning of the lecture, that to hold your questions till the end. So if you have something to jot them down, please feel free, and we'll have discussion and questions at the end. Mainly that's because it's hard to get anything on the CD. So, but at the end we can kind of do that. So that's that's Mecca there. So back to Muhammad. So the interesting thing about Muhammad is that I'm going to read a little bit about Muhammad and why Muhammad is such an important person. The Muslims generally agree across the board that Muhammad is a direct descendant of Ishmael, which Elaine mentioned. When you think of Islam, you think of Ishmael or the Arabs. And this fact was actually accepted by just about all the religions based in that time frame in the medieval times, but it's being questioned now by modern historians. But that's neither really kind of here nor there. So we'll accept that maybe Muhammad is a direct descendant of Ishmael. Now, interestingly, when I started to look through Ishmael, there's various prophets that are accepted by Islam, and they're generally Old Testament prophets before the time up to and including Ishmael. After that, they recognize Jesus as a prophet, and then of course Muhammad. But they recognize Adam as a prophet, Noah as a prophet, and Abraham, of course, as a prophet, and Abraham's son, his firstborn son, as they like to relate Ishmael, because really Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son. He just wasn't the firstborn son as we recognize Isaac as being the firstborn son because of the Jewish lineage. But the story is interesting because we know the story as the Jews know the story, and that's that Abraham offered Isaac up. But in Islam, it's actually Abraham offers Ishmael up. And that's an accepted belief in there. And it says, as Abraham attempts to kill Ishmael, either the knife is turned over in his hand or copper appears on Ishmael to prevent the death. And God tells Abraham that he has fulfilled the command. So unlike the Bible, there's no mention in the Quran of an animal sacrifice replacing the boy. Rather, he is replaced with a great sacrifice. So in the Islam tradition and belief, since the sacrifice of a ram can't be greater than that of Abraham's son, this replacement seems to point to either a religious institutionalism of this, and it kind of leads into modern day Islam, why self-sacrifice is actually the ultimate gift to God. And so not an animal sacrifice, but actually a self-sacrifice, just as the prophet Muhammad was self-sacrificed, and this is their cause in their faith. So Muhammad was born in 570. That was actually in Arab times the year of the elephant. And there's a story that goes on that there was a war going on, and the attacking party was coming into a city close to Mecca and had elephants that were used in warfare. And the story goes that in the year of the elephant, when Muhammad was born, the elephants all stopped on the outside of this town. They got down on their knees and they wouldn't go any further. And then a great storm came up, and pebbles fell from the sky and drove off the attacking army. So that was a significant event, and that's when Muhammad was born. Now Muhammad was born, his father died at the time right before he was born, so he was fatherless at the time. But he was born into a very influential and wealthy family at the time. So the culture at that time was when they were born, the babies were born, they would be sent off to Bedouins in the desert to have them nursed as infants, and then they would learn the Bedouin traditions, they would learn Arabic and things like that, and they would come back at about the age of 5 or so to remain with the family. So that's what they did. They sent Muhammad off as an infant to be nursed out in the desert, as was the custom of the day. And it's according to tradition, 2 angels appeared at this time to Muhammad when he was somewhere between the ages of infancy to about 6. And Muhammad relates this story in the Quran, and it says, 2 angels appeared to Muhammad in the guise of men, opened his breast, and purified his heart with snow. This episode, which exemplifies the Islamic belief that God purified his prophet and protected him from sin, was also described by Muhammad in the Quran. And it says, there came unto me 2 men clothed in white with a gold basin full of snow. They laid upon me and split open my breast, brought forth my heart. This likewise they split open and took from it a black clot, which they cast away. Then they washed my heart and my breast with snow. So amazed by this event, and also noticing a mole on Muhammad's back, so I'm assuming he was talking at this time, he was probably like 5, his nursemaid took him back to Mecca to be with his mother. Now his mother died when he was 6 years old, so he was completely orphaned at this point in time, and his grandfather began to raise him. But his grandfather was also a very influential person, and they had a good bit of wealth at that time. So when he was 25 years old, Muhammad got married to his first wife, and she proposed to him. She was 40 at the time. So they had 3 sons and 4 daughters. The 3 sons died. I'm not sure how that happened, but they did have 4 living daughters. And then later in life, when she died, Muhammad married 11 more wives. And that was kind of an accepted in their culture to have multiple wives based on their religious practices. So, up to about this time, Muhammad's kind of working as a merchant, and he's known for his trustworthiness. He's got a good bit of wisdom, and all this is kind of, Mecca's known for trading, and that's merchandising is what that city is known for. Not agriculture, but pretty much trading and caravans and things like that you think about back in the Arabian desert. That's kind of what's going on. So what happens to Muhammad? What brings about the religion of Islam? Well, that's a good question. So Muhammad is off and he's praying in a cave. He's 40 years old, and the cave's called Al-Hira, and it's called the Mountain of Light, and it's near Mecca. And this is where Muhammad experiences his first encounter with the Archangel Gabriel. And the process of the Quran begins to develop, and other visions would follow. So these visions, this was the first vision Muhammad had, and he would have multiple visions over the next 22 to 23 years. And it's through those visions from the angel Gabriel that the book of Quran is made up of. So that's where we get the Quran from. Now you got to remember that first verse that runs through your mind, that Satan can appear as an angel of light. So I don't really know if Muhammad had a vision of Gabriel, if it was Satan as Gabriel, or he just made it all up. So, who knows? I'm not going to answer that. I'm just presenting what they believe. So that's where he received his first vision in the year 610. The 622 is the start of the Muslim calendar, and that's when Muhammad flees Mecca for Medina. And actually the Quran was compiled after the death of Muhammad. So, and interestingly, unlike the Bible, we have multiple translations of the Bible into English, into all these different languages. The Quran is not translatable per Muslims. It is in its purest state of Arabic language. And that's the only way you can kind of appreciate the Quran as if you read it in the original text. Now that is insanely difficult. I was reading about a man who's an Arabic scholar. The Arabic, our language obviously comes from Rome. Our alphabet's the Roman alphabet. We have capital letters, we have punctuation, we have vowels. The Arabs, they don't have vowels. They don't have punctuation, they don't have capital letters. So what the example he used is they would put the letters BK up there. Well, that could mean beak, it could mean book, it could mean bank, it could mean a whole lot of different words. So you really don't know what the true meaning of that is, because there's so many different variations that word could really mean. And he says it's not like you're coming from a different planet with this language, you're coming from another universe, is the way he put it. But they do not translate it. You can kind of get a translation in English of the Quran, but as they say, to really appreciate it, you have to read it in the original Arabic. So most people can't do that. So that's the beginning of, that's kind of Muhammad in a nutshell. So the Quran, or the Quran, Muslims believe that God's revelation to Muhammad was placed in this book, and it's known as the Quran. Now it's compiled of chapters, and if you look at the length of the Quran, some people say it's about the length of the Gospels, other people say it's about the length of the New Testament. But either way, that's about how long it is. And it's broken down into various stories and chapters, and it's placed not in a chronological order, but in a descending order of length. So they start off with the longest one down to the shortest one. And I think there's 114 chapters. They're called surahs. And interestingly, I read that if you placed them in chronological order, it would go from a peaceful setting down to a very violent setting near the end of Muhammad's life. So, but because it's not placed in that order, you have to you would have to read it in a chronological order to get that out of it. And of course, the Quran in Muslim belief existed when God existed. It wasn't passed down. It wasn't brought about during the time of Muhammad. It was always in the universe. It cancels out everything else. It's the fulfillment of all other works in the past. And it's always been and always has been, according to the Islam belief. And they divide it into 30 parts now. And so when you go on Ramadan for your month, which happens in July, you can recite 1/30 of it each day during your fast. So the Hadith, has anybody heard of the Hadith? I never did either. So the Hadith is, it's the sayings of Muhammad or a report about something he did. So the Hadith is very, very important. It's kind of second in command to the Quran. The Quran was given by God to Muhammad. The Hadith was given to us as sayings of Muhammad. Now the Hadith is where you'll find a lot of teachings that we know of as Sharia law and things like that, and I'll get into that. And it's very important to their system. As it says down there in the bottom of the slide, it helps develop the Islamic legal system, and it's critically important to their religion. So the Hadith, interestingly enough, way back, you can see the dates there, about the time of Muhammad's death, there was collections of these hadiths, these sayings from Muhammad, and some of them were dreamed up because they would get paid for making sayings up, and so then they had to have, there was like 300,000 of these. Some placed the number at 600,000, as you can see up there. So we're talking a whole vast amount of sayings by Muhammad. So they had to have these 6 guys here, the Sahihs and the Sunans. These gentlemen were scholars, and they weeded down through all of these, and they've come out with generally what's accepted now is there's about 3,000 sayings in the Hadith from Muhammad that are accepted. So they had to weed out a whole lot of stuff that was kind of what they felt was made up or duplicated or things like that. So, Islam today, the demographics. Now, you really can't see the slide very well, but the dark areas, the dark green areas are kind of like the 50% Muslims. The light green there, where you can see Saudi Arabia, those countries are primarily over 90% Muslim. Indonesia, down in the lower right-hand corner, the islands of Indonesia, Southeast Asia, those are all impregnated big time with Islam as well. So this is the demographic breakdown of Islam today. So there are a lot of Muslims, 1.2 billion. So that's 1/5 of the world's population. Now, this breaks it down. Where are they? Well, only 18% of them are actually in the Arab world. So that's interesting, because when you think of Muslims, you think of Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, those kind of countries, and Pakistan and Afghanistan, and kind of the Middle East where we think of. But actually the largest community is in Indonesia. It's almost 100% Muslim. And you can see there, this is the ranking of the top 9. Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, Nigeria, and China. Now this is interesting. What's the fastest growing religion in the world? Anybody know? Yes, the Muslims. The Muslims are the fastest growing religion in the world. And that's kind of that's a solemn thought, if nothing else, sobering. Let me jump down here to my notes. This was reported in CNN in April 2015. And this was put together by the Pew Foundation, Pew Research Center, and they're a very respected group that does a lot of surveying. So over the next 40 years, Pew predicts that the biggest winners in religious growth are actually Islam and Christianity. So we're almost, as you can see, Christians, we're going to grow up there to 2060. But the Muslims are tracking at a higher angle there, so they're growing faster. So that means by 2015 that 6 out of 10 people in the world are going to be Muslims or Christians, so one or the other. And it's kind of interesting that some of the other religions are falling off. The Buddhists are actually going down. The Hindus are going up a little bit. But overall, it's kind of, you almost have this good versus evil kind of scenario playing out, where the Christians are growing, the Muslims are growing. And of course, we know who wins in the end. And Pew actually predicts by the year 2100 that Muslims will probably outnumber Christians. And they kind of base all this on as how many people, or how many, the population statistics that are currently, how many children each group has, and the fertility and mortality rates. They base all this on migration, conversion patterns, all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things to think about. And of course, if you're a Muslim, it's illegal to convert. So that's not good either. So, and more than 1 in 3 Muslims is under the age of 15. So they're all, you guys' age, 1 in 5. So that 1 in 3. So that's pretty high. So a lot of young people are turning to Muslims, or they're being born into that. So Muslim women, it says, have an average of 3 children, the highest of any religious group. So they're pushing them out, and that report was 245 pages long. And Christians in the United States actually is going to be dropping from 78% to 66% of the population. And the biggest growth in the Muslim majority right now is going to be in India. So, but still, the Hindus outnumber the Muslims in India, but the Muslims are growing there. So, do the Muslims, these are the 2 main groups of Muslims now, and do they have differences? Well, yes, they do. And you probably heard on the news, what the devil is a Sunni? What's the Shiites? What's all this? I really didn't know. I just know that I hear these terms on the news, and I wanted to kind of see what's the deal, because we know that ISIS kills their own. Lots of times they're killing fellow Muslims, and I often would scratch my head like, I thought these guys were like total anti-Christian, anti-Jew, and here they're killing their brothers. So what's going on with that is the Sunnis are the vast majority of Muslims in the world today. About 80% of the Muslim populations are Sunni. So what's a Sunni? A Sunni is a person that recognizes male heirs of the first four caliphs, or spiritual heads, after Muhammad's death. So anyone really can be a caliph if you're of the Sunni belief. They can kind of stand up and say, I'm a caliph, and if the majority agrees on that, they're a caliph. The Shiites, on the other hand, you have to be a direct descendant of Muhammad to be a caliph, and that's where the breakdown begins to come into. As it says there, you have to be a true descendant of Muhammad if you're a Shiite. Now, most of the Shiites are found in Iran, just about all of them. So 20% of the Muslim population, they're the Shiites. They're just about all in Iran, and that's where you start hearing terms like Ayatollahs. And most of us have been around long enough to remember Ayatollah Khomeini, because he was a real nut job in the 70s, and was able to overthrow the government of Iran, the Shah of Iran, and we had the hostage crisis, and every day we would hear on the news Ayatollah Khomeini. Well, the Ayatollahs are the spiritual leaders of that time, and of course there's an Ayatollah, I don't know his name or offhand, but there's an Ayatollah in Iran right now, because he's a descendant of Muhammad, he's a caliph, and he's very, very inspirational, and he's has a whole lot of influence on government politics. So really, President Ahmadinejad of Iran, he kind of takes his orders from the Ayatollahs, because if he tries to buck them, he'll probably end up with his head cut off. So generally the president of the country has to be in total agreement with the Ayatollahs, and really the Ayatollahs have the last say in the government, how the government's ran over there. Now this is a chart that tells you kind of what the adherents are called. If you're a Sunni, you can go down that column, it'll answer what those are. If you're a Shiite, it kind of goes down there on the right hand column. So this one says that the current Shiites is 10 to 15. It's more like 20 from what I was reading. And the quality, interestingly, down there, if you jump from the fourth to the top, the quality of the imams, if you're a Sunni, you believe that the imams are human, and if you're a Shiite, you believe that they are kind of divine in nature, and they're kind of God figures. And it's a whole nother subject to approach about the belief in the 12th Imam. So there's been 11 Imams. The 12th Imam is supposed to come down almost like the way Jesus Christ comes in the last days. Jesus comes riding on a white horse, puts everything in order, because he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, the 12th Imam does the same thing. When the Muslims are in turmoil and being persecuted and probably have nuclear weapons, the 12th Imam, who's been stowed away since like around 600 and something AD, is going to reappear, and set the world in order. Islam will be the world religion, and everything will be dressed based on the 12th Imam. So that's where you get this kind of scary belief with the Shiites, is they actually believe that they can hasten the return of the 12th Imam by setting themselves up for failure. So if they attack Israel, Ahmadinejad was quoted as saying, he would love nothing more than to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And that's pretty much the basic beliefs. They're the little Satan, we're the big Satan, and if they could wipe us off the face of the earth right now, I'm sure they would try to do that. But if they can do that, even attacking us, and we would retaliate likewise, that would bring forth the 12th Iman. So that's their belief. So if they can hasten the end of the world, they're all about that. So if Iran does get a nuclear weapon, which we probably know they're working on it, they're probably going to use it just based on the fact that, hey, if I could get the Lord Jesus Christ to come back tomorrow by doing something, and that's your belief since you're this high, you're probably going to try to do that. So that's kind of where all this belief system kind of comes into play of why they think like that. So we set our clocks back an hour last night. And I've seen this on Facebook multiple times. So what the devil does this mean? You're entering a Sharia-free zone. Set your watches forward 1,400 years. So this comes from the fact that Sharia law was placed in effect right after the Quran and right after the Hamith came into order. And Sharia law is not a good thing, especially if you're a woman. So if you live in Saudi Arabia, you're under Sharia law. And there's actually been some states that have passed legislation, I think there's 16 of them now, that have passed legislation in their state Congress saying they will never submit to Sharia law. So what the heck is Sharia law? Well, it's the law of Islam, and it's cast from the actions and words of Muhammad, which are called the Sunnah, or the Hamith as another word for the Sunnah, and the Quran, which he authored. So what do we know about Sharia law? Well, we know that there's a lot of it. It's very long, but some of the key points in Sharia law, you can read down through these. If you get caught stealing something besides fruit, you can steal fruit. So you can steal a palm date or a coconut or something like that, and you'll be okay. However, if you steal like a bicycle, which 3 guys in Ethiopia got caught stealing a bicycle, they don't have right hands now. So you lose your hand. And if you're really bad, you lose your left foot too. Criticizing or denying any part of the Quran is punishable by what? Death. So you have to accept the Quran as the Word of God that was in place when God existed, and it's always been. If you even criticize or deny Muhammad as a prophet, that gets you killed too. And we've seen that on the news where I believe it was in Syria where the ISIS guys came around and asked them if they could quote something out of the Quran, like well-known verses. It would be like us quoting John 3:16. Well, if you didn't know that, your head came off, because that means, you're fudging it. You're not a true Muslim, and off with your head. So criticizing and denying Allah is punishable by death. A Muslim becomes a non-Muslim. So if you're going to convert, you better get out of that country if you're in a country that observes Sharia law, and there's quite a few of them. I'll have a list there coming up. A non-Muslim who leads a Muslim away from Islam is punishable by death. So if you go over there in Saudi Arabia and you try to get your friend, your co-worker, I had a co-worker here at my nurse practitioner friend. She spent about 6 years in Saudi Arabia as a nurse practitioner. And she had to wear, if she ever went out, she had to wear the garb. And she says, Saudi Arabia is like 1,400 years in the past. There's no female people driving. They don't give driver's licenses to women, and they're living under Sharia law. So if she ever tried to proselytize somebody over there, she'd have had her head cut off. So you kind of have to tread lightly over there. And you can actually have an arranged marriage. If somebody has a baby girl, for instance, I could arrange that marriage. I'm going to marry that girl when she turns 9 years old. So that's under Sharia law. And a woman can have a husband, but a man can have up to 4 wives. And Muhammad, he had 11 wives. And a man can just divorce his wife, and that's the end of it. But on the other hand, a woman, she has to have consent from her husband to do that. And you can see there that a man can beat his wife for insubordination, which they often do. And that's totally acceptable. A woman is really kind of a piece of property, more so than your peer or your best friend. It's just the way it was back in 1400 years ago. So these are gentlemen. This is a picture of gentlemen that have committed theft at some point in their life. You can see they don't have right hands and they don't have left feet. So they were cut off. And they do that today. You can go on the internet now and you can find multiple pictures like this. You can find how they do it. Sometimes they use a rather large knife. They'll place it across the wrist and they'll smack the blade with a hammer and it'll go down through. Other ways they use like this giant paper cutting guillotine looking thing. Most of the time they are not anesthetized. They just hold them down and that's the way it goes. And this is going on all the time over there. In fact, one of the countries has, like we have our Friday night evening news. They have their Friday night, we're going to stone these people. We're going to cut these people's hands off. So it's on television. So it's like a big to-do. And of course here, if a woman gets raped, she has to find 4 male witnesses to prove that happened. So good luck with that. And you can't testify in court on your own behalf if you've been raped as a woman. And it only carries half the weight of a man's testimony. And you only inherit half of what your brother would get if you were coming into an inheritance, because all these things, women can't drive cars. Generally they have to walk behind their husbands in a public place and things like that. So the list just kind of goes on and Sharia law is a whole lot of that. And I thought I had a slide in here of Sharia law. I have it in my notes where Sharia law is really followed to the T. Afghanistan, 90% of that country is under Sharia law. Bangladesh, 82%. These are the big ones. Djibouti in Africa, 82%. Egypt, surprisingly, 74% of that country. Indonesia, 72%. Iraq is one of the highest, 91%. And Jordan, which is right off the border of Israel, 71%. Morocco, 83%. Pakistan, 84%. So there's a lot of the countries over there that observe that. Even in the United States, they do have some places that observe Sharia law where they have a big Muslim community. Like up in Michigan, they have a lot of towns that are almost infiltrated by Muslims, and they'll observe Sharia law even though it's illegal. But you can haul somebody into a barn and cut their hand off and say, he got hurt in a machine accident or something, I'm sure. So there's still some of that going on even in our country. So this is terms that we hear about all the time in the news. How many have heard the word jihad? Yes, everybody's learned jihad. How many knew what jihad was 10 years ago? Not a clue. So now that's kind of a word that we know what it is. It's a holy, I often think it meant of the holy war is the term I use, but actually the definition, it's a religious duty of Muslims to maintain their religion. And in the Arabic world, it means to strive, to apply oneself, to struggle, or to preserve. I googled the term jihad and I have 38 million hits. So that took me a long time to go down through all those. I did. This is an interesting thing. This is titled Jihad, the Forgotten Obligation. And this article goes down through all the imams and people of a lot of influence in Islam will come up with things for jihad and what jihad really kind of means by their definition. And let me see here. They ask, part of the jihad is which person would attain the most virtue and reward, and that person would be someone who goes and attacks another party, and by doing so, or or if he goes on a suicide mission where he knows he's not coming back, that's the highest honor that's given to a warrior. If you go into battle and you get killed, you still get an honor, but it's not as honorable as if you know you're going on a suicide mission. That's the highest order that you can attain when you get to heaven, is you died for Allah, and you died doing it as a suicide bomber in a suicide capacity. So the interesting thing was, this is 4 pieces of paper that will talk about a little bit about jihad. Each of these paragraphs is what reward you will get, or what belief system they have. You'll be dressed in the clothes of an imam. You're safe from the punishment of the grave. Your sins will be forgiven if you go in as a suicide bomber. So there's 68 pages of this. These are just 4 about jihad. So they're serious about jihad. Make no doubt about that. So you hear the term ISIS. Sometimes you hear the term ISIL. And I often wondered, what's the difference? President Obama, he uses the term ISIL. A lot of the media uses ISIS. And I'm like, well, what's the difference? So ISIS stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So it's just an acronym. ISIL actually stands for more of a larger group. So the L is from a historic name. It's called Levant, and that covers the region of you can see there, from the Mediterranean all the way down to Egypt, and then east over to Iran and to Turkey. So ISIL is more of an encompassing term, but they both kind of mean the same thing. And ISIL and ISIS, those groups of people are hell-bent, for lack of a better term, of seeing Islam in its purest state, which means everybody needs to be converted to a Muslim or your head's coming off. The media, the president tries to water it down and say these are radical Islams, but honestly, they're in their name, the Islamic State. If you go up to a member of ISIS or ISIL, they can probably quote, at least from what I read, at least 50% of the Quran off memorization. So they're religious to a T, more so than the general population of Islam. They're really trying to observe Islam in its purest form. They consider themselves like, I'm really with the program. We have watered down Christians all over the place. Backslidden Christians, just as Nancy was talking about, I go to church. Well, that doesn't really mean a whole lot. And we have many, many Muslims who approach Islam the same way. But we have people that are on fire for Islam, just as we have Christians that are on fire for Jesus Christ. How we carry about our two missions are worlds apart. So, we try to love people into the kingdom. They're proselytizing. They're going to kill you if you don't come into their kingdom. So this is a picture of a young man, a little boy actually. He's probably about 13. This is a very sad story. I just kind of put this in here because if you read this was during the Iran-Iraqi war, which is in the early 1980s. Horrific war between two Muslim countries, the Shiites and the Sunnis. And there was chemical warfare going on. These young children were either volunteered themselves to walk a minefield and blow themselves up for Allah, or the government in Iran would offer the family, you don't have to pay income tax, or you can get a really low interest rate loan if you turn in your kid and volunteer can you imagine, you're going to send your son, your daughter to their death, essentially, and you're going to be rewarded for that. And interestingly, the Ayatollah Khomeini at that time, he ordered about 500,000 plastic keys from Taiwan, little toy keys, and he told these young children, they put a chain on the keys and they hung them on their neck and told them, this is the key to your salvation. You're going to be in Allah's arms. You will have the most high reward because you're a suicide bomber. You're not a suicide bomber, but you're going to commit jihad and you're going to give your life for Allah. and the red and white bandana on there signified that they were going to go into battle, and they literally did. The Iraqi, there's a lot of statements on the internet about the Iraqi army was behind the lines. These children would just come at them in waves, and they would set off the mines, and it was very difficult even for the Iraqis to kill these children, because obviously you're talking 10 to 14-year-olds. And just how far, you can actually see how far this goes into their ideology. And the interesting thing was, a lot of the children volunteered. They were running out onto the minefield. They couldn't wait to get out there and offer themselves to Allah. And this is an article about the boy soldiers. And there's an imam in the front there, one of the caliphs, religious leaders, leading these boys. And they're going to go out into the minefield. And it was boys and girls as well. And it talks about the plastic keys. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of children sacrificed this way. Very sad. This is the kind of mentality you're kind of dealing with here. No? And that's why it's important to kind of understand this. These mentalities have been in effect since 600 AD, 1400 years. So it's nothing new. It's just, it comes to the light now because of modern media. This is the Arabic writing in the Quran on the top. And Sarah is one of the chapters that's found in the Quran, Sarah 5:33. And this talks about the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive to cause corruption. They'll be killed or crucified, your hands and feet. So that's basically what we're talking about here, is if you try to oppose them in any kind of way, they will come after you and they will kill you. They will cut your head off. And it's interesting if you read in Revelation, and I thought it was odd when I read about in Revelation that there's the great crowd of martyrs. It says, it's in Revelations 20. I did have a verse on that, but I think it's 2014. But it talks about, in all the translations I read, that these martyrs, a sea of martyrs in Revelation, were beheaded for the cause of Christ. And I thought 20 years ago, I'm like, that's very odd, beheaded. You don't hear that term 20 years ago. You didn't hear that term 3 years ago, but now you hear it daily. Yesterday, there was a video sent to President Obama from ISIS. I had a slide. I didn't have it in here. I had it at home. I thought it was in here, but it was from CNN. And yesterday at 1 o'clock, ISIS sent a video to President Obama. It was a video showing 3 men getting their heads cut off in retaliation for that raid that we did on the prison last week, where the master sergeant in the army was killed, the special operations raid where we were assisting the troops in that. So in retaliation, they sent a video to, it's on YouTube apparently, and it's just more of the beheading videos that you see all the time now. Christians being beheaded. It just goes on and on. So, now it's all starting to fit into Revelations, this beheading thing. The religion of Islam growing, and it's the fastest growing religion in the world. So, now it's all starting to kind of come together, that the beheading thing is not so remote anymore. It's happening on a daily basis. I mean, before, when I was a kid growing up, the only time you ever heard beheading was with the French with their guillotine, and that was like a zillion years ago. You never heard about people getting their heads cut off. It was just like, no, it didn't happen. Now it's happening. So, I did wrap it up. So, this is the time for discussion and questions. And I think before you have the questions, I think it's just important to know what we're dealing with. We see it on the news all the time. I don't think we should be ignorant of current events that are going on around us. I think it's an exciting time to be living in. And I want you to know, I know Muslims. I don't have any friends that are Muslims, but I certainly seen quite a few of them in the Army that were Muslims, and also there's an engineer that works over in GIW that we're going to draw blood on him in July, and he was observing Ramadan. So he was going through that. They have a fast from like sun up to sundown, and then they can eat for the month of July. So we had to kind of work around that schedule. But he was a Muslim, so they're here. They're here right in our own community. So the good news about Islam is that Islam, like a lot of the religions in the world, are based on works. They're not based on the gift of salvation. We can't do anything to get salvation. We can't pay $10,000 a month to the Salvation Army and that's going to get us into heaven. We're not works centered. We get the salvation as a gift of God, so we don't have to work through that. Islam, the Muslims, they have to work. And the sad thing with Muslims, but it's a good thing for us, is the fact that they're unsure of their salvation until the time that they die. Because their religion teaches if your good works outnumber your bad works, then you'll go to heaven. Well, nobody really knows in that religion. You always have the question in your mind, did I do enough good things to outweigh the bad things? So you really don't know. See, we have the hope in Jesus Christ that we don't have to work through that. We know that by accepting Jesus Christ as our personal Lord and Savior, and we're grafted into the family, we're going to heaven. They don't know that, so they don't have that hope. They have a big, gigantic question mark in the back of their mind. So, in fact, the interesting thing is the growth of Christianity. There's a decline of Christianity in the next 10 years in the United States, but it's growing worldwide, and a lot of the Muslims are converting to Christianity. So that's the wonderful thing. They don't have that hope. Their religion, and I often, the thing with Muhammad having a vision of Gabriel, Gabriel, the messenger of the Lord. Gabriel announced the birth of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is mentioned, I believe, 26 times in the Quran, and I think Muhammad's mentioned 4. So Jesus Christ is mentioned a lot in the Quran. The Muslims believe in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. Now, I found that fascinating. Muhammad is straight up human. There is no deity involved with Muhammad. They've kind of made him that way, but in the Quran he says, I'm just a man. And he was a messenger, and he's a prophet that fulfills the prophecy of Jesus Christ. So they see the coming of Jesus Christ as a great prophet, but Muhammad is the last end-all be-all of this, and he fulfilled it all. But we know that Jesus Christ did that. But they do believe in the virgin birth of Christ, which I found fascinating, because that's quite a step of faith even for anyone, really. And so they know about Jesus, and they know that he was a great prophet. They can't wrap their heads around anything that involves the Trinity, because there's only one true God, Allah. And there is not 3 in 1. There's no Holy Spirit. There's no Jesus Christ. And it's just Allah. That's it. But, every time there's like a chink in that armor where you have doubt of your salvation, if you're going to get to heaven, that's a good starting point. And, it's unfortunate that they censor the internet and all these things in these countries where you really can't get news feed into these places. But they do radio broadcasts, and they direct it into Iran and things like that to try to reach them by the gospel, because it's very hard to, as I said, to proselytize these. If you get caught doing it, your head's coming off. So it's very, very difficult. So, questions, discussions? Yes. Good. No. I think it's probably happening not so much in the countries like Indonesia and Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan. I think it's happening where there's a good mixture, like in India, where you can still, Cindy Tyner just came back from India, where you can still present the gospel of Jesus Christ without fear of getting your head cut off. And I think it's a lot of, not so much Northern Africa. Northern Africa is a lot of Islam, but any of those countries kind of south of like Djibouti and down south of Ethiopia, those countries can still be reached by the gospel. And I think that's where you're seeing a lot of the conversions happening. It's really not going to happen much with Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan because they're so embedded, and you'll get told on in a heartbeat, I imagine, if you would try to be a missionary over there. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, I've heard that too. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's true, and I pray for that all the time. I pray for these ISIS leaders to be like the apostle, Saul was. Saul was hell-bent on killing Christians, and he was good at it. And he had a visitation from Jesus Christ and got converted. So why not have, I pray for that to happen to the ISIS leaders as well, that Jesus Christ will appear to them just as he appeared to Paul, or Saul at that time, and be converted. Oh, awesome. Yes. All right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Just like Jacob and Esau, if you're not in that covenant, then you're not there. Yes. That's for, the question is, do they have to go to Mecca for Ramadan? That's for any believing Muslim. They have 5 tenets of faith, and I can't remember all 5, but one of them is you have to pray to Allah 5 times a day. That's required. You have to believe that Allah is divine and the one true God. You have to go on that pilgrimage sometime during your life. Yes, females, males, no, they go. They probably just have to walk behind the men. They pray just, they can go to the mosque if they want to pray, or like when I was in overseas in Sarajevo actually was a community at that time. That's where you had the Muslims and the Christians fighting, and they would have those towers going off all the time, Allah, with the Arabic and with the loudspeaker. It's kind of funny, but that was their call to prayer, and so they would have to kneel down, bow towards Mecca, and pray 5 times a day. No matter where you are, you always have to face towards Saudi Arabia, east or west, depending on where you are on the planet. Like in Guantanamo Bay, they provided those guys with prayer mats, and they faced east towards Mecca to do their praying. But it's required, and the females pray as well, and the children, and they're all brought up from little up with this. Yeah, mostly the men are in the temples or the mosque. I don't know. I think that's the Arabic calendar, so I'm not sure what AH stands for, but that was the first 620, I believe, is the year number 1 in the Arabic calendar. I'm sure you could Google that and find out what the AH meant. So just as the Jewish calendar, we're like in year 6,000 something, and we're on obviously the Julian calendar, the Roman calendar, where we based everything on the death of Jesus Christ. So the birth of Jesus Christ is our calendar. So the birth, actually the death of Muhammad is where their year 1 starts. So they follow that calendar. So AH must stand for something after Muhammad. Yeah. You can become a Muslim just by doing those 5 tenets that they require. You just have to proclaim that Allah is the supreme God, and you need to observe Ramadan, and you need to pray 5 times, and you're considered a Sunni or a Shiite, depending on which sect you want to chase after. Oh, sure. Famous people have converted to Islam. Sure. And they'll change their names. They get converted, right. Michelle, do you have a question? I think I'm going to read you a passage. This was you can look this lady up. She gave a very good rebuttal to the claim that Muslims is a peaceful religion, and her name is Bridget Gabriel, and there's a YouTube video. She was from the Heritage Foundation, and they were talking about a year ago when Benghazi went down. And they had a panel from the Heritage Foundation, and Bridget Gabriel was part of that panel. And there was a lady in the audience that was a Muslim, and they were talking about Benghazi and what our government response should have been to Benghazi. They didn't address anything about Islam or Muslims at that panel, but this Muslim woman brought up a question that she's a Muslim, they're a peaceful religion, and Bridget Gabriel gave this response, and it's a very good response of what she told this Muslim woman about the religion, because you often hear that Islam's a religion of peace. And this is exactly, I was able to find in English, where they transcribed this in so that I could just cut and paste this, but I did want to bring this out, so I'm glad you brought that up about what's the difference between a U.S. Muslim versus a Muslim in Iraq or Iran. Really, it's pretty much, their belief system's the same. It's kind of like being a watered-down Christian versus being an on-fire Christian. So I'm sure we have a lot of ISIS in this country that just haven't come forth yet. There's a lot of cell groups that I'm sure the FBI is watching. You see it on the news all the time. A lot of times they get caught before they can do something drastic. But this is what she said to this Iranian, she was an Iranian student. She was a college student here. She said there's 1.2 billion Muslims in the world today. Of course, not all of them are radicals. The majority of them are peaceful. The radicals are estimated to be between 15 to 25%, according to all the intelligence services in the world. So that leaves 75% of them peaceful. But when you look at 15 to 25 of the world's Muslim population, you're looking at a number of between 180 to 300 million people dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization in Israel. That is as big as the population in the United States. So why should we worry about the radicals of 15 to 25%? Because it is the radicals that kill, because it's the radicals that behead and massacre. When you look through history, when you look at the lessons of history, most Germans were peaceful, yet the Nazis drove the agenda, and as a result 60 million people died, almost 14 million in concentration camps, 6 million were Jews. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Russia, most Russians were peaceful as well, yet the Russians were able to kill 20 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at China, for example, most Chinese were peaceful as well, yet the Chinese were able to kill 70 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Japan before World War II, most Japanese were peaceful, yet Japan was able to butcher its way across Southeast Asia, killing 12 million people, mostly killed with bayonets and shovels. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. On September 11th in the United States, we had 2.3 million Arab Muslims living in the United States. It took 19 hijackers, 19 radicals to bring America down to its knees, destroy the World Trade Center, attack the Pentagon, and kill almost 3,000 people that day. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. So that's what I say to you as well. And I thought that was off the top of her head, that was an outstanding rebuttal to that peaceful, the religion of peace, because it really isn't a religion of peace. In its pure form, as ISIS will tell you, or ISIL, they're observing Islam at its finest. And they're down to they're observing what really should be the pure form of Islam, and that's to proselytize the world one way or the other. And their way is to, you either convert or you die. Right. Right.
it was just a really very funny feeling for 5 months that, you know, this church. And come to find out, because they were one of there was a famous brother-in-law who was with them. And he said that they were somebody's neighbor, and they didn't even invite it, but like, not that you have to work on it, but can you imagine how unsettling that was? Because she said, you could tell that, you know, he was telling her, she said they were really interested in it. But they didn't make me. She said, I understand.
All right.
You know? And she said that they were looking, and said all of them were looking around for the interviewing picture. But she, you could tell they were looking for the exit. So it's like, oh, if you're going to do something, it's never quit anyway. And you could say, oh, kids were you know, whatever. There's happening. And that was another thing to bring out, because they have this. They, you know, they're producing babies when they're
Right.
babies, and they're producing babies to kill them, to offer them up, because you like at the age that you said.
So I'll close with that. I would like to leave you with one thought that I read on the news, and I thought was very, you know, there's a lot of disturbing things about Islam, and that was, we all saw on the news the Syrian refugees that were kind of blocked in Hungary and Germany and England, and some offered to take them in. And it was about 2 weeks ago that I read this. During this one family, the Syrian family's they were refugees, and they were accepted in Germany, but along the way their teenage daughter was raped. And they were able to find asylum in Germany. Well, in the Islam belief, apparently, if you're raped, you're considered unclean. And the father killed his own daughter, threw her in a ditch, but the authorities found out who did it, and that was the reason why, because his daughter was considered by the family at that point to be unclean because she was raped, so he took care of the uncleanliness and got it out of the family. So, lack of knowledge, that's a good point to end on. So I hope that did answer the first question. Why, you know, we're a Christian church, why in the devil are we talking about Muslims? But the hope is in Jesus Christ, and there's hope for the Muslims as well as there any religion in the world. You know, Jesus came to die for an ISIS leader just as he came to die for you or me. Okay, so you're dismissed.